Chapter 1. The Forgotten Queen. The stars above Krellin twinkled faintly, shrouded by thick clouds of methane and dust storms that swept across the barren surface of the desolate mining colony. It was a world that seemed forgotten by the galaxy, harsh, unyielding, and far removed from the bustling trade routes or glamorous imperial capitals. Yet for some, Krellin offered a strange solace in its obscurity. For Queen Lyrina of Zytheria, it was a prison of anonymity. Once hailed as the Shimmering Empress, a queen renowned for her wisdom, kindness, and unmatched beauty, Lyrina had been unceremoniously abandoned by King Zyril, the ruler of the Zytherian Empire. The Zytherian people, proud and xenophobic, valued bloodlines above all else. When decades passed and Lyrina failed to produce an heir, the whispers began. She was too old, her genes flawed, her womb barren, a failure to the Empire's most sacred duty. King Zyril's decision to set her aside for a younger consort wasn't unexpected, but it was cruel. In a public ceremony meant to cement the Empire's future, he denounced their union, claiming it was for the survival of Zytheria. Within days, Lyrina was stripped of her title and cast out, sent to Krellin, under the guise of dignified exile. In truth, Krellin was no place for dignity. Life in exile. Lyrina had lived on Krellin for over 10 years, blending into the colony's impoverished population. The royalty in her bearing had been replaced by weariness. She lived in a modest dwelling carved into the cliffs surrounding the mining camps. Her days were spent working at a small communal hydroponics farm, where she helped grow edible crops to sustain the miners and laborers. Her once shimmering golden hair had dulled with the passage of time, and her violet skin, which had once captivated kings and scholars alike, now bore the marks of labor and hardship. Yet there was still an unmistakable grace in her movements, a flicker of the queen she had once been. But inside, Lyrina carried a burden heavier than exile. She carried the shame of abandonment, the ache of failure, and the haunting loneliness of knowing she had been deemed useless by the man she once loved. Ethan Voss arrives on Krellin. At the same time, another exile of sorts had arrived on Krellin. Ethan Voss, a human engineer contracted by the Federation of Allied Systems, had been assigned to modernize the mining colony's infrastructure. A former soldier in the Terran Alliance Defense Corps, Ethan had left the military after a disastrous campaign that cost the lives of his entire squad. Guilt and grief had driven him away from Earth and Krellin, provided the perfect refuge, a place where he could bury himself in work and forget the horrors of his past. Ethan quickly gained a reputation among the colony's residents for his skills and unassuming nature. He kept to himself, speaking only when necessary, and worked tirelessly to improve the colony's failing power grid and water filtration systems. But beneath his quiet demeanor, Ethan was haunted by nightmares. The faces of his fallen comrades visited him in his sleep, and every day he grappled with the gnawing question: why was I the one who survived? A fateful encounter. The turning point came one evening at the colony's marketplace. Ethan had finished repairing a generator at the main mining site and decided to visit the marketplace to buy parts for his next project. The marketplace was a chaotic mix of tents and stalls, run by merchants from a dozen different species. Traders haggled loudly over the prices of machinery, food, and rare minerals. As Ethan scanned the stalls, his attention was drawn to a figure struggling with a heavy crate near a small vegetable stall. An older alien woman, her robes faded but meticulously clean, was attempting to lift the crate onto a cart. Her silver hair gleamed faintly in the dim light, and there was a quiet dignity in her movements despite the obvious strain. "Need a hand with that?" Ethan asked, stepping forward. The woman looked up, startled. Her luminous silver eyes met his, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Ethan noticed the faint lines of exhaustion etched into her face, the kind that spoke of years of hardship. I can manage," she replied, her voice soft but firm. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I don't doubt it, but it'll be faster with two." Before she could protest, Ethan lifted the crate with ease and placed it on the cart. He noticed her hesitance to meet his gaze, as if she were wary of revealing too much about herself. "Thanks," she said finally, brushing her hands on her robes. "No problem," Ethan replied, offering a small smile. "I'm Ethan, by the way. New around here." "I'm Lyrina," she said after a pause, her name slipping out cautiously. Well, Lyrina, Ethan said, gesturing to the cart. Looks like you've got a full load. Need help getting this home? For a moment, Lyrina seemed to consider the offer, her expression conflicted. Finally, she nodded. If it's not too much trouble. A shared solitude. Ethan followed Lyrina through the winding paths of the colony, pushing the cart as they navigated the rough terrain. Her small home was carved into the cliffs overlooking the main mining site, a simple dwelling with a small garden out front. You live alone? Ethan asked as they unloaded the cart. Yes, Lyrina replied, avoiding his gaze. It's quieter that way. Ethan nodded, sensing her reluctance to elaborate. He understood the need for solitude. After all, it was the very reason he had come to Krellin for. As they worked, Ethan noticed small details about her home. The meticulously arranged plants in the garden, the hand-woven rugs inside the house, the faint aroma of Zytherian spices lingering in the air. Everything about Lyrina spoke of someone who valued beauty and order, even in the harshest conditions. When they finished unloading, Lyrina hesitated before speaking. Thank you, Ethan. I don't often have visitors. Glad I could help, Ethan said, brushing the dust off his hands. He glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. If you ever need anything, let me know. I'm not far from here. Lyrina nodded, offering a faint smile. I'll keep that in mind. As Ethan walked back to his quarters that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lyrina than met the eye. The Queen's secrets. That night, Lyrina sat by her small hearth, staring into the flickering flames. Ethan's kindness had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of her past, hiding her identity and burying her pain. But Ethan's unassuming presence had reminded her of a truth she had nearly forgotten. She was more than the sum of her failures. As she traced the intricate patterns on the bracelet, she wore a relic of her royal life. Lyrina felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, she could find a new purpose. But she knew the past was never far behind. The Zytherian Empire, though vast, had long memories. If word of her survival reached the wrong ears, she would be hunted. And yet, for the first time in years, Lyrina allowed herself to wonder. What if my story isn't over? Ethan's nightmares. Meanwhile, in his cramped quarters, Ethan tossed and turned as the familiar nightmares returned. He saw the faces of his squad mates, heard their screams as the mission on Delta 47 went catastrophically wrong. He woke in a cold sweat, his chest heaving. He sat on the edge of his cot, running a hand through his hair. Despite the torment in his mind, he found himself thinking about Lyrina, her quiet strength, the sadness in her eyes. There was something about her that stirred his protective instincts, though he didn't fully understand why. Ethan made a decision that night. Whatever Lyrina's story was, he would be there for her. Krellin, for might be a place of exile, but perhaps, for both of them, it could also be a place of healing. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Royal Past. The days following Ethan's first meeting with Lyrina passed with a quiet sense of routine, but beneath the surface, both felt the stirring of change. Lyrina continued her work at the hydroponics farm, carefully tending the crops that sustained the colony. She had always found solace in the rhythm of the work, but her mind now often wandered to thoughts of Ethan. Ethan, for his part, kept busy repairing the colony's aging infrastructure, but he made a point to visit Lyrina regularly. At first, it was under the guise of helping her with small tasks, fixing the irrigation system in her garden, reinforcing the roof of her home, but soon their conversations grew deeper. They talked about the harshness of Krellin, the quirks of its diverse inhabitants, and, tentatively, their pasts. A glimpse behind the veil. One evening, as they sat in Lyrina's modest kitchen sharing a simple meal, Ethan noticed a faint scar running along her temple. It was barely visible beneath her silver hair, but its presence hinted at something more than the mundane hardships of colony life. Lyrina, Ethan began, setting down his cup. I know it's not my place to ask, but who were you before Krellin for? Lyrina's hands froze mid-motion, her gaze dropping to the table. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence thick with unspoken pain. I was someone else, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone who no longer matters. That's not true, Ethan said gently. You carry yourself like someone who's seen more than most of us here ever will. You've got a strength that doesn't come from just living on a backwater planet. Lyrina looked at him, her silver eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of opening up, but then she shook her head. The past is a heavy burden, Ethan. Sometimes it's best left buried. Ethan nodded, sensing her reluctance. Fair enough. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Lyrina offered a faint smile, her gratitude unspoken but palpable. She wasn't ready to tell him everything, but she felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, someday, she could. A visitor from the stars. The next morning, a new arrival disrupted the fragile peace of Krellin. 4. A sleek Cytherian starship descended onto the colony's landing platform, its polished surface gleaming in the dim sunlight. The ship's presence immediately drew attention. Cytherian vessels were a rare sight in the outer colonies, and their arrival usually meant trouble. Ethan, who had been working on a malfunctioning power conduit near the platform, watched warily as a lone figure emerged from the ship. The newcomer was tall and imposing, clad in an ornate black robe trimmed with gold. His sharp features and violet skin marked him as Cytherian, but it was the piercing intensity of his gaze that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The man introduced himself as Varek, an emissary of the Cytherian Empire. His voice carried a smooth authority that silenced the small crowd of onlookers. I seek an individual who resides on this colony, Varek announced. A woman of great importance to the Empire. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who Varek was looking for. A dangerous revelation. Lyrina was tending her garden when Ethan arrived at her home, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Lyrina set down her tools, her heart sinking at the urgency in his voice. What's wrong? There's a Cytherian ship at the colony, Ethan said. Some guy named Varek. He's looking for someone. Lyrina's breath caught. Her worst fears realized. It's me, she whispered. They found me. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. Lyrina, who are you? She sank onto the edge of the garden bed, her hands trembling. I wasn't always a farmer, Ethan, she said, her voice heavy with emotion. I was once the queen of the Cytherian Empire. Ethan's eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt as she continued. My name is Lyrina Zyril, former consort to King Zyril. For centuries, I stood at his side, ruling a kingdom that spanned countless systems. But I failed in my most sacred duty. I couldn't give him an heir. And so, he cast me aside. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the pain of her exile still raw. I was sent here to disappear, to be forgotten. I hope they would leave me in peace. But if Varek is here, it means Zyril hasn't let go. He must want something from me. Ethan crouched in front of her, his expression unreadable. Why would the king care now? After all this time? I don't know, Lyrina admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know the Empire. They don't forgive loose ends. A plan to protect her. Ethan stood, his jaw tightening. We can't let them take you. You've got a life here, Lyrina. You've earned the right to live it. Lyrina looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. What can we do? They'll have resources, soldiers, weapons. We can't fight them. We don't have to fight them, Ethan said. We just need to convince them you're not worth the trouble. Lyrina frowned. How? Ethan's mind raced as he formulated a plan. I'll go to Varek. I'll tell him you've moved on, that you're no threat to the Empire. If we play this right, we can make them leave without ever realizing you're still here. Lyrina hesitated, the weight of his offer sinking in. You'd risk yourself for me? Ethan smiled faintly. You're worth the risk. Confronting Varek. Ethan found Varek in the colony's administrative office, where the Cytherian emissary was interrogating the colony's overseer. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan stepped inside, his presence drawing the attention of both men. You're looking for Lyrina? Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. She's not here. Varek turned to him, his sharp gaze narrowing. And who are you to speak for her? I'm someone who knows she's done with the Empire, Ethan said. She's moved on. If you've come to drag her back, you're wasting your time. Varek studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You speak with conviction, human, but the king has ordered her return. It is not your place to interfere. Ethan crossed his arms. The king gave her up, sent her here to rot. If he wants her back now, he's got no right to demand it. Varek's lips curled into a cold smile. You are bold, Earthling, but boldness does not make you immune to consequences. Ethan held his ground, even as Varek stepped closer. You can threaten me all you want, but the truth doesn't change. Lyrina isn't your concern anymore. Leave her in peace. A new ally. To Ethan's surprise, Varek didn't respond with violence. Instead, he tilted his head, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. Interesting, he said softly. Perhaps the Queen has found something more valuable than the Empire. Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Varek turned and strode out of the office, his robes billowing behind him. As the door closed, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The encounter had left more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The Zytherians weren't done with Lyrina, and Ethan would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Chapter 3. A Bond Forged in Fire. Ethan left the colony administrator's office with his heart racing. He knew the conversation with Varek had bought them only a little time. The Zytherian emissary wasn't leaving without a plan. His cryptic remark about Lyrina finding something more valuable gnawed at Ethan's mind. When Ethan returned to Lyrina's modest home, he found her sitting on the porch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her silver eyes betraying her anxiety. Did they leave? She asked, her voice trembling. Not yet, Ethan admitted. But I told him you're not their problem anymore. Lyrina gave a sad smile. You think that will stop them? Ethan shook his head. No, but I think it'll slow them down. Varek knows there's something different about this place about you. He hesitated, then added, I don't think they're here just for the king. What do you mean? She asked, sitting straighter. I think they're afraid of what you represent, Ethan replied. You're not just some forgotten queen, Lyrina. You're a symbol. If they let you live in peace, it shows the Empire can be defied. If they take you back, it's not just about control, it's about erasing any chance of rebellion. Lyrina's gaze fell to her lap. I'm just one person. What rebellion could I lead? Ethan crouched in front of her, his voice steady. It's not about leading armies. It's about showing people there's a choice. And that scares them. An unexpected gesture. The conversation left them both shaken, but there was little time to dwell on the implications. Over the next few days, Ethan helped Lyrina fortify her home, setting up basic defenses and securing her garden from prying eyes. He stayed close, keeping a watchful eye on the Zytherian ship that still loomed over the colony's landing platform. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Lyrina surprised Ethan with a gesture of gratitude. She handed him a small vial filled with a shimmering blue liquid. What's this? Ethan asked, holding it up to the light. It's called Elthever, Lyrina explained. A Zytherian elixir. It strengthens the body, quickens the mind. It's rare, and it's powerful. You may need it, if things come to violence. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're giving me the good stuff, huh? Lyrina smiled faintly. Consider it a thank you, for staying when you didn't have to. Ethan pocketed the vial, his expression softening. I'm not going anywhere, Lyrina. You don't have to thank me for that. The attack. Their fragile peace shattered the following night. The sound of boots crunching on gravel jolted Ethan awake. He grabbed his plasma pistol and rushed to the window, his stomach sinking as he saw a squad of Zytherian soldiers approaching the house, their black armor glinting in the moonlight. At their head was Varek, his robes billowing ominously. Ethan turned to Lyrina, who stood frozen in the center of the room. They're here. We can't fight them, she whispered. They'll kill us. Not if we outsmart them, Ethan said, grabbing the Elthever vial. He downed the liquid in one swift motion, grimacing at the bitter taste. Almost immediately, he felt a surge of energy coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses and quickening his reflexes. Stay here, he told Lyrina. I'll handle this. Before she could protest, Ethan slipped out the back door, moving silently through the shadows. The soldiers hadn't surrounded the house yet, and he used the element of surprise to his advantage. Taking aim, he fired a precise shot that struck the lead soldier's weapon, rendering it useless. The squad scattered, shouting orders in Scytherian. Ethan took down 2 more soldiers with quick, calculated shots before they regrouped. Varek, who had hung back, shouted, "Enough! I want the queen alive." Ethan cursed under his breath. They weren't going to retreat without a fight. Lyrina's decision. Inside the house, Lyrina watched the chaos unfolding outside, her heart pounding. She couldn't let Ethan fight alone. Grabbing a small, ornate dagger she had hidden among her belongings, she stepped out into the night. "Varek!" she called, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'm here. Leave him out of this." The soldiers froze, their weapons lowering slightly as they turned to face her. Varek smiled, his expression predatory. "Ah, there you are, my queen. I was beginning to think you'd let your pet human die for you." Lyrina glared at him, her fear giving way to defiance. "You have no claim over me. Whatever Zyril wants, he'll have to demand it himself." Varek's smile faltered. "The king has no interest in you anymore. But the Empire. We have other plans. Your survival threatens the order we've built. Come with us, and I'll ensure your death is swift and painless." Ethan stepped into view, his pistol aimed at Varek's chest. "Not gonna happen." A queen's power. Before Varek could give the order to attack, the ground beneath them rumbled. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and a faint blue glow surrounded Lyrina. Her eyes widened as she felt the power coursing through her, a power she hadn't tapped into in years. The AEL Thever, once reserved only for the Scytherian royal family, wasn't just a physical enhancer. It awakened dormant abilities, and in that moment, Lyrina realized she hadn't lost everything. The Scytherian bloodline carried a connection to the energy fields that permeated the galaxy, and as a former queen, she had the strength to wield it. The soldiers hesitated as the glow around Lyrina intensified. With a flick of her hand, she sent a shockwave rippling through the air, knocking them off their feet. Varek stumbled backward, his confident demeanor replaced by shock. "You think I'm weak," Lyrina said, her voice steady and commanding. "You think exile made me powerless. But you were wrong." Ethan watched in awe as Lyrina stepped forward, her presence radiant and unyielding. The soldiers scrambled to retreat, dragging their injured comrades with them. Even Varek seemed to reconsider his position. "This isn't over," Varek hissed before activating a recall device on his wrist. In a flash of light, he and the remaining soldiers vanished, leaving the battlefield eerily quiet. The morning after, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan and Lyrina sat together on the porch, their bodies weary but their spirits unbroken. The battle had left scars on the land, but for the first time, Lyrina felt a glimmer of hope. "You were amazing out there," Ethan said, his voice filled with admiration. Lyrina shook her head. "I didn't even know I could still do that." The AEL Thever. It woke something in me. "Good," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Because we're going to need that strength. They'll be back." Lyrina nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll be ready." As the sun rose higher, casting its light over the colony, Lyrina realized she wasn't alone anymore. Together, she and Ethan had forged a bond and fire, a bond strong enough to face whatever the galaxy threw at them. Chapter 4. A Stand Against the Empire. The quiet after the attack was short-lived. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the colony. Whispers of the exiled queen, who had unleashed her latent power against a squad of Scytherian soldiers. Though the residents of Krellin, for were used to hardship, this was a level of danger they hadn't faced before. Many began to avoid Lyrina's home, their glances a mix of fear and awe. For Ethan and Lyrina, there was no time to dwell on the colony's reaction. They both knew that Varek's retreat was not the end, it was a prelude to something far worse. The Scytherian Empire would not tolerate failure, and reinforcements were inevitable. A plan to fight back. Early the next morning, Ethan spread a map of Krellin IV's terrain across Lyrina's table. "We need to prepare," he said, tracing his finger along a narrow canyon near the edge of the colony. "If they send a larger force, we can't defend your home directly. But this canyon? It's tight enough to funnel their forces, and we can set up traps to slow them down." Lyrina watched him work, her expression both wary and grateful. "You're risking everything for me, Ethan. If the Zytherians find out you're helping me, they already know, Ethan said, cutting her off. I'm not going to sit back and let them take you. We've come this far, we finish this together. Lyrina hesitated, then nodded. What do you need me to do? Ethan smiled faintly. Let's hope that power of yours wasn't a one-time thing. If they get past the traps, we'll need it. The colony's decision. As Ethan and Lyrina prepared for the inevitable, the colony's overseer, Dren Maller, paid them an unexpected visit. A stout, grizzled man with weathered green skin, Dren was usually content to stay out of other people's business. But the arrival of the Zytherians had forced his hand. Grayson, Dren said, stepping into the house without invitation. The council wants to talk to you. Now. Ethan glanced at Lyrina, then back at Dren. If they want to blame me for the attack, they can save it. I don't have time. They don't want to blame you, Dren said, his tone grim. They want to decide what to do about her. Lyrina stiffened, her gaze dropping to the floor. Ethan clenched his jaw, his voice cold. She's not the problem, Dren. The Zytherians are. And yet, they wouldn't be here if not for her, Dren said. You can't expect the colony to stand by while she puts us all in danger. Ethan stepped forward, his posture tense. Lyrina's done nothing but help this colony. She's worked, she's kept her head down, and she's tried to live a life in peace. If the Zytherians have a problem with that, it's on them, not her. Dren sighed, his expression softening slightly. You've got guts, Grayson. I'll give you that. But guts won't protect this colony. If you've got a plan, you'd better share it. Because if you don't, the council might decide the Queen's exile needs to end permanently. Preparing the canyon. With Dren's reluctant support, Ethan and Lyrina were given a small window of time to act. The colony agreed to help in whatever way they could, but it was clear their patience was limited. Ethan knew that if they failed to repel the next wave, the council would turn on Lyrina to save themselves. The preparations in the canyon were grueling. Ethan worked tirelessly, rigging explosives and building barriers with whatever materials the colony could spare. Lyrina assisted where she could, but her focus remained on mastering her abilities. The energy she had wielded during the first attack had come instinctively, but now she needed control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan found Lyrina practicing alone. She stood in the center of a clearing, her hands glowing faintly as she focused on shaping the energy into a shield. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. You're pushing too hard, Ethan said, stepping closer. I have to, Lyrina replied, her voice tight. If I can't control it, I'll be useless when the time comes. You're not useless, Ethan said firmly. You never were. Lyrina's hands faltered, the glow fading as she looked at him. You don't understand. I spent centuries being told I wasn't enough, that I failed my people, my husband, my empire. This power is the only thing I have left. Ethan stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. That's not true, Lyrina. You have more than that. You have courage. You have a heart that cares about people, even after everything you've been through. And whether you believe it or not, you're enough. You've always been enough. Lyrina's eyes glistened, but she managed a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Ethan. The battle. The Zytherians returned 3 days later, their numbers doubled. 2 dropships descended into the canyon, deploying soldiers armed with advanced weapons. At their center stood Varek, his expression one of grim determination. Ethan and Lyrina were ready. The first wave of Zytherian soldiers triggered the traps Ethan had set, a series of explosives and collapsing barriers that slowed their advance. From a hidden vantage point, Ethan picked off stragglers with his plasma rifle, his shots precise and unrelenting. When the second wave pushed through, Lyrina stepped forward. The energy field she had summoned during the first attack returned, brighter and more controlled. With a sweep of her hand, she created a barrier that deflected the Zytherians' plasma fire, forcing them into disarray. Push them back, Ethan shouted, reloading his rifle. Don't let them regroup. Lyrina unleashed another shockwave, sending several soldiers sprawling. But the strain was beginning to show. Her breathing grew labored, and the glow around her flickered. Varek seized the moment, charging through the chaos with a blade of crackling energy. He closed the distance between himself and Lyrina, his expression triumphant. "This ends now, my queen." Before he could strike, Ethan intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled, their movements a blur of fists and weapons. Varek's blade slashed across Ethan's side, drawing blood, but Ethan refused to yield. With a final surge of strength, he disarmed Varek and pinned him to the ground. "You lose," Ethan growled. A new future. The remaining Zytherian soldiers retreated, unwilling to face Lyrina's power or Ethan's determination. Varek, battered and defeated, was taken prisoner by the colony's militia. His departure marked the end of the immediate threat, but the colony knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As the dust settled, Lyrina approached Ethan, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You're hurt." "I'll be fine," Ethan said, though his wince betrayed him. Lyrina placed her hands over his wound, the faint glow of her energy field enveloping him. When she pulled back, the pain had lessened, and the wound was partially healed. "Thanks," Ethan said, offering a tired smile. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay," Lyrina replied. "I don't know what comes next, but I don't want to face it alone." "You won't," Ethan said. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Epilogue: A Second Chance. In the weeks that followed, Lyrina and Ethan became unlikely leaders in the colony. Lyrina's abilities and wisdom earned her the respect of even her harshest critics, while Ethan's unwavering loyalty and resourcefulness cemented his place as her trusted ally. Though the Zytherian Empire loomed as a constant threat, the people of Krellin stood united. And for the first time in years, Lyrina felt a sense of hope not just for herself, but for the future they were building together.